My name is Chelsea Troy. My job, as you heard, I'm a machine learning operations engineer at Mozilla. That's my day job. But I primarily consider myself a teacher. I teach at the University of Chicago, and I teach a variety of workshops. I don't know that I believe in fate, but I do believe that if there's such thing as folks having a purpose, this is mine. I said I was going to talk to you about tools we still need to build with AI. And evidently the title brought you to this room, so it did something right. I'll tell you what I can do. I can certainly talk to you about the questions we still need to answer, in part with tools that don't exist yet. I'm not hearing good answers to these questions from folks whose enthusiasm for generative technology overtakes their willingness to think critically about this space. I give workshops on generative technologies for O'Reilly. We frequently spend an appreciable amount of time both discussing the fear of generative technologies taking over people's jobs and reviewing the fact that when an LLM says it wrote you some code, that doesn't mean it actually ran the code for you or anything like that. I think both of these questions become a lot less confounding and scary when we understand how these technologies work, what they're designed to do well, and how our industry has adapted to shifts in technology like this one in the past. I also don't think that AI doomsdayism has a lot to offer us on these questions either. The answer in those circles seems to be that what we need to do is throw the whole thing away or regulate it immediately. And though I agree that regulation should carry more priority in tech in general, not just AI, it would be unprecedented for that to happen now. And even if it did, we'd still be left with all of the questions of enforcement and effectiveness that we face in already regulated endeavors. Generative AI products have already reached a level of ubiquity that would make them very difficult to yank off the market and stuff back into a jar. So I think that we as technologists carry a lot of responsibility to build the tools that put us in the AI future that we want to live in. And I think that to do that, we can benefit immensely from looking at our past. In fact, I'm so convinced of that I'm about to spend an appreciable length of time talking to you about what we can learn from the patterns of commercial tech platforms that came before the AI spring, and I'm basically going to expect you to sit there and let me do that. I'm hopeful, though, that looking at patterns from our past can help me sketch out a framework of product development for you that will help you generate and analyze your own ideas about AI tooling. Because I can't give you the list of tools that I need you to go and make to earn your millions and save the world with AI. Unfortunately, I'm not that smart. That's why I teach, is so I can steer other people who are smarter than me to do the things that maybe I would do if I had the intellectual firepower. What I can do is give you a framework for conceptualizing product innovation in the tech space at this, what I think is the dawn of a sea shift in the availability of a substrate consumer technology. I'm making a bet that I can prepare you to come up with such a list and maybe even execute on it and, cut me in for 2% if you feel like it. So I'd like to take us all the way back for a second to the 90s with the dawn of the consumer-oriented web browser. Products and companies that we remember from the first 10 years of e-commerce often came from college dudes. You remember this? These were the eBay days, the early Amazon and Google days, the days of a couple of other companies that I'm going to bring up throughout this talk, which I didn't check the speaker list before I put those companies in this talk, so I'm hoping nobody who works at those companies and is speaking is going to be mad at me about any of this later, but we'll see. Back to the college dudes. These college dudes, they were frequently wealthy and well-connected, but they weren't usually specifically market savvy. They were more like computer nerd types, right? So these people, now billionaires, have given lots of interviews on how they got started, and frequently they have this message that goes something like this. I built a thing that I wanted to use, and other people liked it. That was literally it. Folks heard interviews of this nature? So in the book, How the Internet Happened, the author, Brian McCullough, he relays a story like this of Pierre Omidyar talking about the founding of eBay. At the time, you could absolutely buy things on the internet already, but the classic example would be like going to some random guy's website to buy a copy of a VHS tape. Familiar? It's not a fake example, by the way. It's how Rand Gautier sold the personal footage of Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson that he stole from their home in that decade. You might remember this. That was the reputation at this time of buying and selling things online. Pierre started eBay as an experiment on his personal website. It happened to be in the right position to implement some way to make peer buying and selling less sketchy online. That product, with that timing, paved the way for the customer rating, an opportunity for the crowd to grade sellers on their reliability and product quality in the absence of more formally oriented regulation structures, which I'd argue for the internet still haven't materialized, right? Amazon ratings, Yelp, and other crowd soliciting products have succeeded in commercially answering this need instead. So Pierre at eBay didn't start with a bunch of consumer research. He was playing with the thing on his personal website, and it took off. Now, how often do you suppose that the tech unicorns of today come from some college dude independently thinking up an idea? Today, tech companies, particularly large ones, approach product development pretty differently to that. There are a few reasons why, and we're going to talk about them, but today, instead of building stuff based on whims, curiosity, and pure unadulterated self-interest, product managers want to be data-driven. They focus on quantitative methods to find product market fit. They interview people who use the product or survey people in majority groups that they would like to see using the product. They also regularly triangulate information from product surveillance data. Let's return to our customer review example for a second, right? Born of the peer-to-peer selling boom with eBay as the flagship examples, these sorts of reviews now have whole sub-industries around them. Publishers in the tech space will choose what titles to publish based on which titles from their competitors sell the most copies on Amazon. Then they'll trawl the reviews of those books to look for information about what the books lacked and coach their own authors to fill in those gaps. Institutions know that this data matters. So there's also a cottage industry around hiring folks to give reviews, or even better, spin up some bots to give a whole bunch of good reviews, right? And then, of course, you have your counter industry for separating the real reviews from the fake ones, but we'll get there later. Build for yourself worked for founders in the 90s, but now gets cast as immature and short-sighted. What changed about tech in between then and now? Understanding what changed, I think, reveals a false dichotomy between building for yourself and building based on your focus group data. And revealing that false dichotomy is going to help us sketch out a pattern of the way that visionary products get built. But before we address that false dichotomy, I want to talk about some product failures. Because declaring that eBay won because of timing simplifies this story way too much. There are plenty of other ways besides bad timing to torpedo your chances at product success. We'll jump forward in time about 20 years for a second, and don't worry, we're going to connect this all together eventually. I'm going to talk about Slack as an example. So, in 2021, the messaging app company built direct messaging across Slack instances. It was even in production before anybody being a lot of the internet, pointed out that the feature could hardly cater to harassers and stalkers more perfectly. If this misuse case could become so apparent so quickly the moment the feature hit the market, how did Slack fail to catch it before investing in the feature in the first place? I was very relieved to see that the speaker list did not include anybody from Slack. What happens here is companies collect data and then focus on the highest ranked outcome, or the majority outcome. Keeping focus on the center can lead organizations to efforts that don't innovate and sometimes don't even work. So You may remember that in the fall of 2020, Americans protested the curtailment of the United States Postal Service in favor of private options like FedEx or UPS. Wealthy folks in populous areas don't realize the difference between the United States Postal Service and the private options, but I think it's a really great example of the difference between government policymaking and standard business decision-making, which we're going to critique in more detail in a second. The reason the United States Postal Service matters so much is that the United States Postal Service delivers everywhere. As in, a postal worker mounts a mule to deliver letters to the Havasupai people at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. That's what you're seeing in this picture right here. 4 mules and then a horse in the back. Businesses often tend to focus on efficiencies, doing the things that net them the most money for the least effort. By contrast, taxpayer-funded public programs are designed and expected to cover everyone, including and especially the most marginalized. This is why they're taxpayer funded, so they don't face existential risk to be eschewing profit-driven decision-making. Does this work perfectly? No. But I think about it a lot when people kvetch about the bigness and slowness of government. That bigness and slowness is supposed to create space and resources to account for the communities that a lean approach deliberately ignores. Business decision-making tries to approach product development by citing data that centers majority opinion, which is not where visionary ideas come from, particularly not in saturated markets. Put a pin in that idea. We're going to come back to it. Anybody know who this is? Cool. We'll talk about it. So folks tend to argue that businesses are profit-driven and therefore have to do things this way. I think executives default to the decision-making strategies to which they've become accustomed. That doesn't mean they have to do it, and that doesn't mean it's the best approach. To understand why not, let's return to the Slack Connect example. That product, as originally conceptualized, had to be delayed for redesign and then re-released with major changes. That was likely a very expensive development effort. Had the design process included a marginalized, abuse-informed opinion, they might have enjoyed a much more streamlined market entry. Or take Google's decision in 2020 to withhold Tumneet Gibru's work on their ethical AI team. This is Dr. Gibru right here. She was one of 4 researchers at Google to participate in co-authorship of a paper called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. Can Language Models Be Too Big? Anybody familiar with this paper? I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. But the paper did a lot of work to demonstrate, to document and demonstrate the carbon footprint of training large language models. It also pointed out the biases and prejudices that they could recreate from patterns in training data, the way that the imbalance in training data trended toward the languages and linguistic norms of like rich, highly online cultures, which can result in the homogenizing effect that the resulting models can have on language and culture. It also discussed the degree to which the illusion of meaning of the language coming out of a convincing language generator can be used to generate and spread misinformation or deliberately mislead. It was those 4 chief dangers of large language models that this paper dealt with. Following discourse at Google about the findings and methodological rigor of the paper, with counter-argument from other Googlers claiming that they'd never received examinations of their literature review at Google before they were allowed to publish papers, the Google AI lead, Jeff Dean, subsequently made the decision to terminate Gibru rather than address changes at the company to acknowledge and mitigate the risks of large language model development that the paper discussed. The trust that Google lost from doing that came with a price tag. Companies that lose the trust of hiring prospects have to work harder to recruit. They have to compensate higher to get their offers accepted. And the folks best positioned to drive visionary product strategy in the AI space aren't going to go there at all. I'm not saying this is why Gemini, Google's LLM product, lags so far behind ChatGPT in terms of customer satisfaction. But I am saying that that's the kind of lackluster outcome that companies in the AI space can learn to expect a few years after sending signals that affect their ability to hire people with marginalized perspectives. You might argue to me that a couple of failures at companies that ignored the margins doesn't prove anything. That's fair. When does centering a marginalized perspective produce success and riches for a company? Anybody know who this is? Generally more recognition. Let's back up to 2007 for a second. In 2007, we got the iPhone. Steve Jobs himself presented the iPhone to the world at Macworld that year, and the story of that presentation has become part of tech industry canon. Supposedly, that demo was an absolute miracle, never worked in any of their rehearsals, and the entire executive directorship of the company was sitting in the front row with whiskey for the whole thing. But it worked, and it became a big deal in industry. Why? Because the iPhone was not just a product. The iPhone was a different thing entirely. It was a platform. It was a place where other people and other companies could eventually build their own products with their own mobile applications. The iPhone wasn't just a product launch comparable to eBay or Napster or Amazon's original book sale website. By being a platform, it changed the tech industry the same way the commercial internet itself did. It didn't just enter a competitor into the space. It created a whole new product arena in which tech companies could compete. How did Apple manage to do this? People love the iPhone as an example of visionary success for a tech company, and I love it because everybody uses this example while completely miscontextualizing it. What made the iPhone a platform rather than just a product was, most famously, its capacitive multi-touch screen, which is a term that we use to describe this screen that you can put buttons on anywhere you want and touch anywhere you want. That screen, unlike the tiny keyboards on other mobile devices of the day, made it possible to dream up any user interface design. That feature enabled the iPhone's ascendance to the status of platform for independent application development. It broke the market for existing phones. Where did that screen come from? Turns out, Steve Jobs wasn't some kind of genius visionary who independently thought that thing up. Anybody know who these people are? I guess I ruined it with my caption. Dang it, I'm making the talk too accessible. I'm ruining all my, it's okay. Its roots came from Fingerworks, which was an accessible human-computer interaction company founded with the express purpose of creating input devices for folks with compromised fine motor function. One of the founders, Wayne Westerman, wanted to build a way for his disabled mom to continue doing all the things that she wanted to do. And that grew into a company, which Apple bought in 2005. Capacitive multi-touch technology was not Apple's idea. Steve, in fact, visionary Steve, had to be cunningly convinced through a whole lattice of coordinated strategies among the engineers beneath him to put the thing in the iPhone at all. In fact, most of the things you love about your smartphone started as accessibility features. I told you earlier that we'd come back to an idea. That idea was that garden variety, Pareto principle style business thinking doesn't work for visionary product development. Companies can incur costly failures by misapplying it. Companies can also achieve momentous victories by approaching product development questions differently. Designing for the edges can produce something better for everyone. But what does this have to do with data-driven product decisions? How did we get to data-driven product decisions from build for yourself? Well, let's summarize what we've learned so far. First of all, building for the majority group identified in summary statistics doesn't produce visionary decisions. Second, organizations can incur costly failures and even product irrelevance by doing that. Third, organizations can achieve momentous victories by prioritizing marginal business cases. The catch is that building for the majority group identified in summary statistics is exactly the trap that data-driven decision-making can fall into. So, Back to the original question I started us down this tangent with. You don't have to read this. It's an account of somebody talking about what it was like to live in San Francisco in the 90s compared to today. What changed in tech from the 1990s to now that influenced the switch from well-positioned college kids building their dreams to dads in graphic tees analyzing spreadsheets? What changed was who constituted the marginal business case. Stick with me here. So in the 1990s, personal computers as a mainstream thing were brand new. That's when we get the paradigm-shifting, visionary internet successes like eBay, Google, Apple, Amazon, eventually Netflix. Netflix is kind of the youngest famous child of this particular generation of the commercial internet. Anybody remember who Netflix killed? Blockbuster, that's right. Before Netflix, Blockbuster is where you went to rent movies. You picked up a physical VHS tape or DVD, and you took it home, and you brought it back before a specific due date, or else they charged you more money. This was how it worked. Netflix didn't even start as a streaming service. It started as a service where you could go online and make a list of movies you wanted to see, and they would physically mail you the DVD, and then when you were done, you would mail it back. And this worked, and people actually mailed the DVDs back, and it killed Blockbuster. And it eventually launched a race for competing services like Amazon Prime and Hulu and HBO Max, and it wasn't even a streaming service to start with, but it's one of the companies we list when we list the modern tech titans, the FANG. People heard of this? The FANG: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, then Google. You know where visionary ideas come from? Let's break this down because I need you to see this. We describe ideas as visionary when they break from majority logic to imagine a completely different future, one that serves currently unserved needs or poorly unserved needs, or poorly served needs, and also poorly unserved, I suppose, in a completely new way. You know who has unserved needs or poorly served needs? Marginalized groups, people that the current systems ignore or rebuff. Visionary ideas derive directly from centering people at the margins. Now, what the heck does centering people at the margins have to do with wealthy, well-connected college kids making stuff up for fun? To understand that, we need to talk about what marginalization meant in the 1990s when the consumer web as a platform was new. At that time, in situ applications like bookstores, post offices, auctions, and blockbusters had a service gap, location dependence. You had to be at the place. That limited access to folks with time and transportation. It limited access even for wealthy, well-connected college kids. This right here is a strip mall. This picture was taken in 2005, which I know because it was after FedEx bought Kinko's, but before FedEx killed the name Kinko's. You've got in this picture a cleaning service, a Kinko's, and then you've got a place to buy shoes, a place to buy sandwiches, and a place to get a cash advance. How many of these services can you access from your laptop or your phone today? All? Yeah, at least 3, arguably all. In the 90s, what'd you say? In the 90s, maybe 2 on a technicality, but pragmatically none. The location of the wealthy, well-connected college kid founders might have exacerbated their experience of location marginalization in the 90s. See, the US looked different then. The big stuff from a STEM perspective was still largely in Boston or New York City or down the East Coast. Silicon Valley was growing, but it wasn't what it is now. These kids, they were not at the center of everything from a location perspective at all. In fact, they were all the way across the country from it. They were there because in the 50s and 60s, electrical and mechanical engineers moved out west to do hardware research, usually for defense companies like Lockheed. And they had kids who grew up and became the dorm room garage billionaires. The dorm room garage billionaires managed their riches and visionary status in large part because, for a glimpse of time, when the consumer web blinked into existence, those privileged kids experienced a marginalization, location marginalization, that the web suddenly made addressable. By building for themselves, in that glimpse of time, they centered a marginal need to access resources and communities without cotemporal co-location. For that glimpse of time, in other words, because everyone experienced a marginalization that this new platform, the web, addressed, even the most privileged person building for themselves was centering a marginal need, was visionary. Nowadays, of course, tech doesn't look the same. We've had the commercial internet for 30 years. The market is saturated with products that well-connected rich dudes got to build for themselves. Building for already centered people doesn't produce visionary ideas. We see this in the patterns of success from the secondary ventures of the same folks who built for themselves in that first generation. Their most successful investments in the late aughts tended to either live in e-commercial logistics or in businesses that pursued an empirically confirmed demand for a product or service, data-driven companies. The others include and look a lot like Twitter, a company that generated enormous enthusiasm among investors, but notoriously struggled to become or stay cash flow positive. Tech has noticed this shift, but it doesn't want to admit the whole well-connected rich dudes saturating the market part. And so it has summarily discounted build for yourself as a product strategy instead. And this is where we run into the false dichotomy. Product teams forget the context of build for yourself that they discount in favor of data-driven decisions. And this has tragically obscured their potential for actual visionary work. Here's why. It's not building for yourself doesn't shift paradigms. It's building for yourself on a saturated platform doesn't shift paradigms if you are already the main character on that platform. Those are very important contextual nuances on this building for yourself doesn't shift paradigms idea. Technical product teams, it must be said, are overwhelmingly led by people who are already the main characters in tech. So those main characters building for themselves doesn't and wouldn't produce visionary ideas. It would largely produce incrementalist, weak-willed, unvisionary work. But under those same circumstances, a data-driven approach that centers majority opinion also produces incrementalist, weak-willed, unvisionary work. In a saturated market, achieving visionary product outcomes requires centering the still marginal needs, which often means centering marginalized people and addressing their concerns. Over the course of the last 30 years, we've had the chance to watch the maturation of a platform and the products that do well on it through the commercial internet. The first generation, when the consumer internet was new, got to build for themselves with the confidence that the platform itself addressed a marginalization that everyone was feeling, so their products captured the enthusiasm and the dollars of the public. Surrounding and following the release of Netscape Navigator, which was the first web browser for the public, we see the launch of companies like Amazon, eBay, Google, Netflix. The second generation, when the consumer web got saturated, had to look for smaller crevices to fill. And it found some by looking at data, because the public got to identify the opportunities that the garage dudes had missed. Someday a garage dude is going to be really mad at me over calling them this. But Netflix, so Netflix got to jump on an early one of these opportunities, right? With the release of a video streaming service in 2007. We got Twitter in 2006, we got Slack in 2009. All companies with significant contributions to the blogosphere on the topic of data-driven product decisions. The third generation, the hardest generation to succeed in by clinging to mainstream ideas, but the one from which the biggest innovations tend to burst, requires us to find a need that the current platform either cannot address or has not bothered to address. We're firmly in this territory of platform maturity with the consumer web at this point in 2024. I think we can argue that the iPhone introduced another platform with its own generations of product development. It did this thanks to hardware innovations it acquired from folks who were trying to make computers more accessible, who were trying to address a marginalized accessibility need, the sort of need perhaps most likely to end up being popular with everyone. Shortly thereafter, in 2008, Apple released the App Store, and then anyone could make a mobile app. The top apps from 2009 included Google Maps and Amazon Kindle, both products from established tech companies that had data suggesting these things would be popular on the pocket computer. They also included Yelp, notably, an app with a Garage Dude story. Supposedly, Jeremy Stoppelman, the wealthy and well-connected PayPal alum, caught the flu and couldn't find a doctor to visit in San Francisco, and in response built Yelp for himself, and boom, success and riches, which is amazing. I think if I caught the flu and I couldn't find a doctor, I would probably lay in bed until the flu went away. Arguably not a great idea. I'm not saying do what I do, but don't take my. I'm here to talk to you about tech. Don't take my advice on medical matters. In 2010, we get the founding of Uber, also supposedly the brainchild of rich tech alums Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp after they couldn't catch a cab in Paris during the Le Web conference. I find these anecdotal stories particularly illustrative of the privilege point, though. Imagine having the resources to be like, man, catching that cab was annoying. I guess I need to just quit my current life trajectory and play for a while with the idea of spinning up a whole company to make sure I don't have to catch a cab again. It's okay if it fails because I have the cushion to withstand that failure. These stories are fun to tell and hear, but they're not like practical mogul origin stories for the vast majority of tech workers, are they? So then, we have the mobile market maturing further. You don't hear Stoppelman or Kalanick's story among the top apps from 2022, which mostly include established tech products like Facebook, the WhatsApp messaging app owned by Facebook, the Instagram social media app also owned by Facebook. You've also got Sequoia-backed TikTok there, and CapCut, which is an editing app directed at TikTok users. These are companies known, in some cases notorious, for a voraciously data-driven approach to product development. Facebook, notorious for collecting data, yes? Smaller operations can still find their niche in mobile, but the platform market maturation process moves a lot faster now than it did in the 90s. It moves faster because with each platform in tech, the folks who struck it rich in the first tech boom get further and further ahead. In the 90s, the dorm room garage dudes had an appreciable head start on relationships and resources to build the commercial web, but most of them weren't literal billionaires. By the time the mobile platform came along, those same people were literal billionaires. This gave them an order of magnitude more opportunity to move first on mobile. Over time, that lead has only continued to grow, and with it, the time from platform creation to market saturation has shortened. We don't just have the opportunity to resort to data-driven and marginally centered product vision approaches faster. We have to. We have to, because those are the accessible opportunities outside of the major upfront capital, relationship, and research investments. In 2022, we also got the release of ChatGPT, a product produced by a company, OpenAI, founded with heavy involvement from some big known tech names, and currently invested in by Microsoft to the tune of $10 billion. ChatGPT also depends on 10 to 15 years of research from Google and others on specifically how to build large language models. We tend to think of ChatGPT and its competitor, Google Gemini, and text-to-image generators like DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. We tend to think of those things as products. But I think there's an argument to be made that they operate more like platforms. A sea shift, this time not in hardware, but in the software available for the construction of an entire market right on top. Now, if I'm right about this, we're pretty close to the beginning of the platform market maturity cycle on this platform. People are integrating with generative models. They're trying to figure out how to make products with them. Every existing software as a service app's landing page is like, now with more AI. But if I'm also right about the market maturation process speeding up as the lead of the first movers has increased, then that means the easy opportunities to build with and on top of this platform are going to go quickly. You don't have to read this either. This is me asking ChatGPT for something and it giving me a one-paragraph response. You're not going to learn anything new from that response. But I use it as illustrative because when we endeavor to think about the advent of generative models as a platform, we can structure an exploration of the tools we might build around these 3 generations of product development that we've talked about. So first, of course, we've got the open season. The new platform removes the limitation that so much of the population faces that just about anything addressing that limitation could see a lot of traction. What broadly experienced limitations do generative models address right now? I can think of a few. A big one is prose generation. Models trained on the essays, text, and answers of the internet can reproduce that structure with reasonable reliability. It's worth noting that what those models do is replicate patterns of language, not regurgitate truth, not produce knowledge. Here, you can see, I asked ChatGPT for a 1-paragraph overview of a course about the psychology of decision making. It can offer me a plausible course description, not because its understanding of pedagogy led it to this as the most appropriate description of such a class, but because it can replicate the language patterns of texts that discuss psychology. But the replication of patterns in language itself does remove a limitation. First of all, writing, even generic milquetoast writing of the kind produced by generative models, takes time to write by hand, so they've seen massive adoption as a general purpose templating tool for exactly that sort of milquetoast writing. A lot of the writing that we do is milquetoast writing, right? A lot of it is sort of mainstream, not intended to be too provocative writing. Suppose, for example, you need to write a cover letter and you're experiencing a depresso espresso from losing your last job or managing your burnout or like, I don't know, living in an end-stage capitalist pandemic hellscape at the doorstep of a fascist takeover and a looming climate crisis. Just tell it like it is. The point is, you can't manage to get the ding-dang thing done. And at this point, you're not really trying to wow anyone. You just need something. ChatGPT can draft that cover letter for you. It can also draft you up a reference letter for a student or a colleague, so you can skip the step where you look up the basic template, and you can get right to filling in the vague and platitudinous central paragraph ChatGPT provided for you with your actual anecdotes about this person. Or maybe your coworker is getting on your last nerve, but you can't sound upset via email because that's not okay in the workplace. So you need your thoughts translated into something more corporate acceptable, you know? Or maybe your boss's 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 boss has asked you, again, to justify why precisely you need time to update and maintain existing software. And you're afraid that copying and pasting your most recent justification under the phrase, per my last email, is going to get you fired. So instead, you turn to the endlessly patient and deferential LLM, which might come up with a different wording from you, and make it less obvious that you've said these exact things 1 million times before, and you know it, and they know it, and you know that they know it. But perhaps the most meaningful use case for a language replicator has to do with the specific language it works for. The language of the internet from whence its training data was scraped. As Timnit Gebru and her research colleagues correctly pointed out in the Stochastic Parrot paper, these LLMs train most and perform best on the linguistic tropes present in the language of the internet. Well off, well connected, and in many data sets, largely Anglophone, the English language. Folks who have written code for a decade, but whose first language isn't English, can get help writing their cover letter to apply to a Californian software company, and then make it to the technical screen where they get to showcase their coding skills. This is a space in which we see a lot of the first movers fighting right now. The folks with the capital to take the market for tools like these. I don't know that it's realistic to dream about a next generation language replicator that beats the ones in development by Microsoft, Google, or Facebook-backed teams. Tech just isn't anybody's game like that. It hasn't been for a long time. But that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of other dreams still available. Besides the open season, we can leverage data. I'll give you a second to count the fingers. So besides the open season, we can leverage data, focus groups, aggregates, or even data collected or scraped from other products or companies to find additional opportunities. Within machine learning, the whole prospect of the thing being based on identifying patterns in data makes this an interesting one to consider. We've used classical machine learning models on tabular data for about a decade now to identify and leverage patterns in data. We figure out which customers have the highest estimated long-term spending prospects based on historical data, and then we pay the most attention to those customers. Or we identify, based on people's search habits, at which point somebody's ready to buy a plane ticket and gouge them at that point, so on and so forth. The airline companies are doing this, not the browsers. I want to be 100% clear about that. My employer would like to make sure that I clarify that. Generative machine learning focuses on identifying patterns in data precisely to replicate them. Make text that sounds like a human might have written it. Generate images that look like the images a human might actually annotate with a text phrase like the one in data, or generate a text phrase given an image. Replicating a pattern convincingly is not the same as understanding or factual accuracy. And we've begun to see some of the places where the patterns don't include quite enough information to produce accurate results. Fingers, of course, are a hilarious one. But some of the most both accessible and impactful examples come from professions that succeed and fail by their precise use of the appropriate proper nouns in the appropriate places. Proper nouns, like the names of cases that a lawyer might try to use as legal precedent for a ruling they're trying to get for a client. One of the thorny details of practicing law is that the cases you cite are supposed to exist. We face similar challenges in software engineering. If you're trying to find a library in your programming language of choice to handle an integration or cryptography or any number of other tasks, best generally if it exists. Although, if you ask a chatbot for a library recommendation and it recommends to you a cryptography library that doesn't exist, that's still not as bad, maybe, as a library that does exist and looks like it does what you want, but actually has malware in it, and didn't exist until a hacker asked the bot enough questions to understand what package names it was going to hallucinate, such that they could go and make those packages with malware in them. We have security researchers who have tried this. Hugging Face-CLI is a real library only because somebody asked ChatGPT about libraries and a number of other LLMs. I don't want to just pick on ChatGPT here. And then made it for the purpose of research to see who would download it. It did not take long before one of the product teams at Alibaba had in their README the instructions to download the library. It's worth noting that the security researcher did not actually put malware in that library. It was a research effort. You could put malware in one. I'm not recommending that as the tool you should build with AI in this talk, by the way. I want to clarify that also. But there's a reason that hallucination happens. And there's a reason that these large language models struggle with these sort of proper nouns. The replication of language patterns depends on identifying what words are used when. And how is that done? It's done through context, the surrounding words, in particular, the preceding words during language generation, which is what these models are doing. Part of speech words, like prepositions, have strong relationships with context, right? They're used in very particular ways contextually, and they're the sort of thing. First of all, they're a thing that's a little bit unique to English relative to other languages, and so it's a great example of the use of something like ChatGPT for writing, because ChatGPT will tend to get those things right, despite the fact that they are the most challenging for somebody who's fluent in other languages that don't use these things. When learning from context, when it's learning how to write English from those sorts of relationships as opposed to from the concepts it's actually talking about, it tends to be good at those things. After prepositions and such, nouns and verbs and adjectives have the strongest relationships with context, with specific scenarios. You know what's low on the list? Proper nouns, because they are contextually interchangeable. We would talk about or refer to any piece of case law or any software library with very similar language. You could not tell from the words around a piece of text about a library what library they are likely to be talking about. Not the same way you could do with something like prepositions. Because these pieces of language are contextually interchangeable, a language generator can easily put something there that sounds right in context, but just isn't real. I don't think citing real case law or using real software packages is going to become less important in the fields that we work in. So the problem presents a demand for ways to identify what's true, because the language patterns are convincing, and as a result, people confuse large language model responses for truth. The headline right here is hilarious. Lawyers blame ChatGPT for tricking them into citing bogus case law, because it makes this app sound like some sort of duplicitous snake in the Garden of Eden. But the claim, according to the firm that employed the attorney, Stephen Schwartz, who used ChatGPT to dredge up this fake case law, is that Schwartz didn't understand the technology and thought it worked like a normal search engine whose outputs he couldn't verify because it just somehow had access to case law that he couldn't access. Now, obviously, the firm would say that, but I actually believe them. I do. I believe them because I have mistakenly made myself the bearer of bad news on not one but two occasions to professional software engineers who did not want to understand that when ChatGPT says, I ran this code for you and got this result, followed by a result that could not possibly follow from the code that it's talking about, it's not because ChatGPT has some super special secret compiler hidden somewhere that it's running for you. What it's doing is repeating the pattern it saw online, in which Stack Overflow people responded to questions like, can you please write and run this code for me, with the words, I ran this code for you and so it is responding like that. I had a guy break down on me in a Discord channel over this while I was trying to go get ice cream. I felt almost too guilty to eat the stuff. False information isn't a new problem, right? Actual human beings have been bullshitting on the internet since the minute they got keyboards. Like, we were talking about this earlier. eBay and similar peer-to-peer sites implemented customer and then seller reviews as a means of popular verification of what people were putting online. Google made its hay in the late 90s and early 2000s in search algorithms doing the same thing, attempting to weight the reputable sources more heavily, in part based on how many other sites linked to them. Wikipedia has a whole editor system focused on preserving the site's populist roots while maintaining the information's accuracy. When the fake review market came to game the customer reviews and search engine optimization came to game the search algorithms, new verification procedures emerged. In 2023, Mozilla purchased a company called FakeSpot, dedicated to using deep learning models to identify fake product reviews, for example. Could popular verification or link tracing, or communal editing, or automated classification strategies play a role in separating real and fake in generated text? Today, researchers try to validate information out of large language models by various means, or have models identify their sources, but it's nowhere near a solved problem. Would fine-tuning a general LLM on case law fix this? or forcing it to check proper nouns against a registry, or coming up with a different schema for precise professions like these entirely? I think there are a lot of questions to answer here, and tools that we don't have yet. These are 2 comments that I made on student papers, so I'll talk to you about them. Proper nouns are not the only weakness in these systems. They can plausibly replicate code integrations, but inevitably real programmers have to get those to actually work. So, as mentioned before, I teach at the University of Chicago. Being a teacher in 2024 means fielding student attempts to get ChatGPT to do their homework for them. If there's one thing I've learned about teaching after doing it for about 15 classes, it's this: no matter how many times you tell people something, sometimes they just got to find out the hard way. So I've started incorporating the expectation that students use ChatGPT into my teaching practices. For a recent assignment, I asked them to analyze some code they had written in a prior class. They were to look for opportunities, they were to look for and identify examples of high coupling, low cohesion, and low optionality, and then either defend the decisions they had made or describe alternatives. Except I had them feed the assignment through an LLM and then analyze the LLM's answers to tell me whether they agreed or disagreed with both the example identification and the code qualities, as well as the suggestions of the system. Unsurprisingly, it took little time for students to find themselves disappointed. One student's ChatGPT answers confidently cited high coupling between a variable and that variable's setter. Recommended decoupling those 2 pieces of code at once. Another's recommended, as a solution for a slow function in a deliberately minimal version of the pandas data analysis library, simply importing the original larger library as a dependency. Here's a question. Is there any way to systematically leverage these systems for building the actual understanding that these systems lack? I don't mean getting the language replicators to understand things. I mean using the language replicators to remove barriers to help human beings understand things. We've got plenty of data to suggest it's not just the machines who could use a little more understanding. What tools could we build to realize that opportunity? In other words, what does data tell us about the opportunities that generative models reveal? And what do the model's outputs tell us about the places we can better understand and leverage the way we use them? I've offered you some examples, but a data-driven line of inquiry can help you add a few items to your previously shorter list of obvious to you opportunities to build tooling with, around, and for AI. But I confess, it's in the 3rd generation zone that I find myself thinking the most. This is the generation of the platform maturity cycle in which the remaining opportunities come from centering precisely the marginal cases that the first 2 generations deliberately ignored, or overlooked, or missed, or cast aside. Though it requires perhaps the most creativity to consider, it's also, I think, where the biggest innovations come from. Because what is innovation, if not creativity, deployed in service of the unmet need? We understand that text-to-image generators are made possible by massive web scrapes, including the work of independent creators. And that those independent creators now feel disincentivized to post their original work online. As we discussed before, the results from these generators are global averages. They're amalgams of what already exists. They can't push boundaries in the creative direction. They can only mimic what they've seen artists already do. So, how do we go about preventing creative stagnation? Do we find ways to enforce copyright on the images themselves? Introduce pixel-level adjustments to image data posted online such that a model trained on that data performs poorly on future production data? We refer to this as model poisoning. Or do we change the value and the role of derivative work versus work with a specific voice? Similarly, we've seen the code these things, right? If people copy pasta that into their code bases for long enough, those code bases are going to end up becoming unnavigable. How do we prevent that? Do we need to worry about preventing it? If spinning up a new code base from scratch later might just take a few prompts? Do you think we're about to be in a world of legacy hellscapes or a world of constant rewrites? And how would we prepare for either future? AI companies crow about their goal to build products that replicate all economically valuable human labor. What does that goal cast aside about the value of human labor? What does economically valuable mean? And what gaps there, the ones left behind, can we find ways to serve? If you've heard me speak or read my writing about product development and innovation before, then you'll have heard me say this. When it comes to having vision for the future of a technology built by and for the people that tech currently centers, marginalized people have a distinct advantage. Improving human-computer interaction for folks with motor impairments in mind led to the screens of modern smartphones. Many of the world's favorite productivity hacks grow from productionizations of coping mechanisms for folks with executive function disorders. And this is true of many different marginalizations, not just those impacted by ableism. Stability AI isn't thinking about how generative models might better address the needs of single working mothers, or formerly incarcerated people, or trans children. Those folks have vision that mainstream tech doesn't have, and maybe can't have. It won't surprise you to learn that I don't think the dorm room garage gang building for themselves can independently launch us into the future we want. I think the best, and maybe the only pathways to innovation, require us to focus, as we build new technology, on the marginal cases, the people for whom the status quo works least well. What this means for AI, I can't claim to answer completely. But I'm hopeful that having a framework for thinking about it can help you come up with answers, because it's going to take all of your unique perspectives, lived experiences, and contributions to put us in an AI future that we want to be in. If you like hearing me talk about stuff, this is one of the main places you can find me on the internet. It's my blog, which I've written for 10 years at this point, about tech and the tech industry. This is where you can go to buy my online self-paced workshops. I do group discounts in case you'd like to have your team at work tackle one of these as a lunch and learn subject. This is a great way to tell your team that they need to get better at like tech debt management or risk analysis or feedback culture without you personally having to be the one to deliver the message. I will be the cover. I also teach workshops through O'Reilly about machine learning in general and large language models specifically. And I teach at U Chicago Python and a special topics course about making an impact in tech now. I announce the O'Reilly workshops on my email list from the blog, and then also on my Patreon, and I post some of the lectures and activities from my courses also on my Patreon. Finally, this is my handle most places, perhaps most notably Twitter and Mastodon. I'm not as online as I used to be, but you can follow me there, and you can also email me at chelsea@chelseatroy.com. I think I ran my time, but I am happy to take questions throughout. I'm here all day, and then I'm here for a lot of tomorrow as well. I'd be thrilled to hear from any of you about any of this stuff. And that's all I have for you. Thank you so much.